my pleasure to have Assemblyman Fred Thiel welcome the rest of his moderating table, and we look forward to a really good discussion. Fred?
You know, the estuary program does go back to what I remember actually was being the first study was called the BT Camp study, which is the brown tide study and the first initial response to the brown tide, which was more than 30 years ago. And what we're going to try to do with this panel today is not look back, but look forward to what we need to do in the future. I think we've had a pretty good summary thus far of some of the things that have happened over the last 30 years. But the question is what are we going to do next? And we have a very distinguished panel that represents the 5 eastern towns to do that. We've got 3 town supervisors. We've got from the town of Riverhead, Sean Walter, the Riverhead town supervisor. From the town of East Hampton, we have the East Hampton town supervisor, Larry Cantwell. Representing Shelter Island is, I think, their town engineer, John Cronin. Representing the town of Southampton is their town supervisor, Anna Throne-Holst. And representing the town of Southold is Mike Collins. So we have all of the 5 towns represented today. And what we hope to do at the beginning here is to have a bit of a discussion on what each of the towns views as the problem, what they think should be happening, what needs to be the plan for the future and how to accomplish that. I'm just going to make a few brief remarks. We'll turn it over to our town representatives. And then as Kevin said, we want to leave plenty of time also for questions. The one thing I will say at the outset is every time I do one of these Peconic Estuary conferences, it always starts about 9 in the morning. And I'll be driving over here from Sag Harbor, and I'll get a call about 20 minutes to 9 or 8:30 from Kevin McDonald, making sure that I'm actually coming. And every time he does that, I want to pick up the phone and say, is that today? But I don't want to give him a heart attack. But thank you, Kevin, for all you've done with the organization here. And one of the things I want to point out, I think, as we go forward with this discussion is how we are in a time of transition. When we were beginning with a lot of these things, the Community Preservation Fund was mentioned, the Central Pine Barrens Act was mentioned. There was a great deal of focus on land use, zoning, land preservation, land acquisition, reducing population, the maximum population, largely through zoning. But the focus was always on the land. And yes, we were dealing with water quality issues, but the feeling was, generally speaking, that if we preserved enough land, if we rezoned enough with 5-acre zoning and 3-acre zoning, in some cases towns have 10-acre zoning, if we reduced enough of the population, if we preserved enough of the land, we would protect our water quality. We would not have to be concerned because by what we did on the land, because we have a sole source aquifer and because of the watersheds, if we took care of land use, we would have we would maintain our water quality. And as it has been mentioned, we've had great success with regard to water quality. With regard to land preservation. We have the Community Preservation Fund, 10,000 acres preserved. We have the Central Pine Barrens, over 50,000 acres preserved. We've upzoned properties. But the fact of the matter is that water quality has continued to decline. And that has led us to the conclusion that we have to do something different other than just focus on land use. Because most of the land is spoken for now, particularly on the South Fork, to a lesser degree on the North Fork. Land use and zoning and all of that is still important, but there has to be more if we're going to reverse this trend of water quality. And I think that's why we're here today, is to try to come up with the new CCMP with a plan that reverses that trend of declining water quality. And we certainly have seen some actions in Albany over the last year, largely because a lot of people in here advocated for those, and some of us on the panel advocated for that. For example, some of the changes working with Senator Laval that we've seen in Albany this year was $5 million for a Long Island-wide nitrogen reduction plan, which I think there's going to be the kickoff meeting of that in the next few weeks. Several $1 million for Stony Brook University for a water quality research institute, which I'm sure Supervisor Thornholz will talk about. $200,000 in additional money for the Peconic Estuary program. And a proposed amendment to the Community Preservation Fund that would allow a portion of the funds in the future to be used for water quality projects. And I think if you look at all these, it really gets down to three real parts of this that I hope now that our panel will talk about. First of all, you need a plan. We need to be doing something different. We need to have a plan. Second of all, we need to have the technology and have affordable technology to be able to implement that plan. And third, we have to have the money to be able to buy that technology and implement that plan. And those, I think, are the three issues that each of the towns have to focus on, and hopefully working with county government and state government and federal government come up with a plan that each has to participate in and will help to contribute to the problem. So the four questions that really are for the town supervisors to discuss, that I hope each of you will get an opportunity to address as part of your discussion. And again, we want to give each of the town representatives maybe 5 or 6 minutes to talk about your plan and what you think is necessary. And then hopefully after each town representative has had the opportunity to do that, perhaps we can get the questions from the audience. But the questions that are really focused, and I should point out this is really a nitrogen-based focus right now. I think public enemy number one with regard to water quality has been identified as being nitrogen. And the questions really circulate around that, and that is, what might the nitrogen reduction strategy look like in your town? What are your town's primary challenges facing this strategy? What are the most essential elements for reducing nitrogen input in your township? Please name one or two. And what can citizens do? And I think this is extremely important. Having been somebody who's been in government for a long time, there's always this kind of thing is that, well, government needs to solve all these problems, and certainly government needs to be a part of it. But each and every one of us as citizens have a responsibility. We're always talking about what rights we have as citizens. Well, on the other side of that equation is also responsibilities that we have as citizens, and that is certainly the case with water quality. So I'm going to ask Larry Cantwell to lead it off from the town of East Hampton and really discuss what he sees from his position in the town of East Hampton as to what needs to be done, what the town of East Hampton is doing, what they need to do a better job, all those kinds of things that are part of this question.
Thank you, Fred.
You're welcome.
Great to be here with you all today. Fred stole some of my thunder because I was going to make the very point that he made regarding all that has been done with respect to land use efforts, open space acquisitions, and the like, CPF funding. I mean, in East Hampton Town, for example, 40% of the land area has been preserved. We have, I think East Hampton has been a leader in land use planning for many, many years. And yet, this summer we saw algal blooms in Wainscott Pond, in Georgica Pond in East Hampton, in Hook Pond in East Hampton, and Fort Pond in Montauk. We have problematic hotspots in Lake Montauk, it's actually a marine harbor, in Accabonac Harbor, and in Three Mile Harbor, and Northwest Creek. I think 20 years ago, if we looked at the efforts that have been made in land use and open space preservation and the like, and we thought that we would be where we are today with respect to the impacts that we're still having on water quality, we probably would be surprised and shocked, because of all the accomplishments that have been made, we still have serious problems in our community. I guess my message today, if I was to give one message, and we have a lot of preeminent people here, county, state, local, environmentalists, government leaders, political leaders. My message today is, on a federal, state, county, and local level, when it comes to water quality protection, we're failing. We're failing. For all the efforts that have been made, all the accomplishments that have been so far, with the Peconic Estuary program, and all the efforts that have been made locally, we're failing. And I think a lot of it has to do with nitrogen reduction and a regulatory regime. I mean, it's nice to talk about, look, on the East End, you basically have a septic, individual septic system, wastewater management. You're not going to replace all those septic systems with sewer systems, nor do we want to. That's why we adopted the kind of zoning that we have. And yet, we don't really have in place a system for replacing these failed septic systems. In East Hampton, we did a comprehensive wastewater study. To some extent, I think we're ahead a little bit on that curve by identifying all the septic systems in our town and identifying areas where they're failing throughout the town of East Hampton. So we need a regulatory regime that's going to push up a requirement that that's a failing septic systems be replaced. And that's going to require coordination with Suffolk County and the towns. It would be great if, look, the county's a different place, west and east. Place an opportunity for the extension of the CPF program, which I'm sure we all support, and the possibility that with voter approval, some portion of those funds, up to 20%, could be used in the future for water quality improvements. So there's an opportunity, I see, at least in my town, to provide some funding, possible incentives for people to replace their failing septic systems. And in East Hampton, that has got to be one of our primary priorities.
Thank you, Larry. I'm just going to ask you maybe one or two questions before we go to the next speaker. And you have identified the need to upgrade and improve septic systems. Maybe you could share with us if the town has gotten that far along, and that's why we do planning. And maybe the other town representatives will address this also. Clearly, septic waste has been identified as one of them. It's clearly not the only issue with regard to nitrogen, but it is one of them. How many septic systems are there in the town of East Hampton? And do we have an idea, for all the towns, but just for East Hampton, about how much it might cost if, with existing technology and existing costs of that technology, what we might be looking at in the way of a capital investment, which, absent some sort of incentive or some sort of subsidy from government, would largely right now, because they're private septic systems, would be borne by the private homeowner.
Thanks for putting me on the spot, Fred.
That's why I'm getting the big bucks for this.
Yeah, I know. I don't have that number off the top of my head, but we did, the comprehensive wastewater study did identify several thousand of septic systems that are failing, either because they're legacy cesspool systems or failing septic systems. In East Hampton, because of planning, we have harbor overlay protection districts with additional land use requirements in order to try to protect our harbors and bays. Clearly, that's an area where I think we would want to focus our attention with respect to replacing septic systems. But it's a look. Take 10, 20,000. Some of the new systems, could cost that and possibly more, and multiply that by 1,000, and you have some idea of what the potential investment is. Probably, I don't know, what is that, $20 million? I'm guessing off the top of my head. So it's sizable. On the other hand, Fred, if we have a concrete plan for use of CPF funds to improve water quality in our town, and we would need, the law is going to require us to put that in place, and we would want to have a very clear plan So when the public goes to the polls in November, they know exactly what they're voting for. You know, we're fortunate. We've collected $250 million in CPF funds since its origination. The last several years, we've collected over $20 million a year in CPF funds, and we've been very aggressive in spending those funds. But if 20% of $25 million, you know, is $5 million a year, that's a very sizable continuing investment that the town could make in water quality improvement. So that funding source really is, I think, critical to improving water quality in our town.
Thank you. And I want to remind people that if you do have questions for the question part of this, that to you know, write out your question and pass it to the end of the table. It will get brought up to us, and we will ask your question. And Kevin, because he is a fount of information, reminds me that there are 40,000 septic systems on the East End. And that is the main method of septic disposal, but it's not the only method. And our next speaker is our host town, the town of Riverhead, and Sean Walter, which does operate a sewer district for a portion of the town, and we have others. Sag Harbor has a sewer district, for example, and Greenport, they do exist out here. That is part of the infrastructure here on the East End. And I'm going to turn it over to our next speaker, Sean Walter from the town of Riverhead, where, you know, the issue of operating a sewage treatment plant is something that is part of this, it needs to be part of the strategy.
If I stand, can you hear me all? So I want to tell you to flush as often as you want here, because it goes to Mike's sewage treatment plant, and we get paid for the water and the sewage disposal. So, you know, we need you to flush. Go ahead. It's okay. I say that to say this. People will pay for proper septic and clean water. I'm the most conservative guy sitting on this panel, soon to be re-registered in the Conservative Party. And I will tell you, people will pay. How do I know that? Well, and I'm not bragging one way or the other, but I own a house, a 4-family house in the city of Oneonta. And we have sewers, and we have public water. And every year, I pay between $1,500 and $1,900 a year for the sewer and public water, and I don't water my grass. And I happily pay it because it doesn't go into the Susquehanna River. I have another house. It's actually on Lake George, on the outlet at the very north end in Ticonderoga. I never water the grass. I wouldn't even think about putting fertilizer down. And I pay $250 a quarter for water and sewer. And I happily pay it. The interesting part about Ticonderoga is they have a combined cycle plant, which probably doesn't work. It just means it shoots it all over the Chute River. Does everybody know what a combined cycle plant is? Stormwater and sewage. But nothing goes into Lake George. If you've ever been to Lake George, you don't have algal blooms. So I don't understand, you know, we sit here, we plan. I guess maybe my tenure as supervisor has been more tried to take action on things. So tried to take action, we did. Now Michael Reichel is going to talk to you about something that I'm just going to mention for a minute, which is the upgrade of the Riverhead sewage treatment plant. Now for palm card purposes, we reduced nitrogen by 75% in our new sewage treatment plant upgrade. Now I want to thank our county legislator, Al Krupski, Steve Malone. They gave us $8 million to upgrade this plant. The town of Riverhead is one of the only towns that operates both two sewage treatment plants and a water, the Riverhead Water District. So we handle both. At my home, I pay not even probably $100, $150 a year for water. At my office, where I try to water the grass once in a while to keep it an even shade of brown, maybe I pay $300 a year. So it's the cheapest commodity we have, but yet we're dumping our waste in a pit and nobody understands that this is a problem. I also joke around about my old style sewage treatment plant at the office where it runs down the side of the hill and the grass uptakes the nitrogen. And I'm actually proud of that system because that's doing something other than the pit. So what is Riverhead doing? I think we've been a leader in this area for many years. You all come here to shop if you're from the East End. Route 58 is all sewered. Downtown Riverhead is all sewered. Most of the houses between here and Route 58 are sewered. See, the fathers, I don't think they were really the fathers in the 30s built the Riverhead Sewer District and the Riverhead Water District because they had some forethought that it wasn't a good idea to just dump everything in the Peconic Estuary. We operate the Calverton sewage treatment plant. All of Calverton is sewered. So what are we doing? Well, Michael's going to talk to you and give you a tour at 1 o'clock about the Riverhead Sewer District and the reduction and the plant upgrade, which is going to taking our plant to a biomembrane filtration system, which is really a neat filtration system that is going to reduce nitrogen tremendously. Michael's going to also show you a golf course, which is pretty neat, and they do this in other areas of the country, and I'm not saying anymore, but it's pretty neat what Michael's a leader. He's been after this about 20 years. So what are we doing at Calverton? Calverton is undergoing a map-in plan for our new sewage treatment plant. Senator LaValle, Assemblyman Thiel, Assemblyman Palumbo helped us obtain $7 million in grants to upgrade the Calverton sewage treatment plant. You might be interested to know it's a secondary treatment plant. It's just no nitrogen removal. So we are going to upgrade Calverton to a tertiary treatment plant, and then we're moving the outfall north of the groundwater divide. Right now it goes directly into the Peconic Estuary. Do not pass go. What did we do with land use? We all talk about land use. Riverhead has done many things with land use. It's 2-acre zoning. We've exhausted our CPF funds and then some. We really only get about $3 million a year. One year we got $6 million, and we've exhausted that. So there's really not going to be too much that is going to come from CPF, even if we refinance our CPF debt for wastewater. So we've got to be more creative. So more creative as we beat up on the legislature to get money. So the $7 million upgrade is coming. We also took EPCAL, which is probably the last regional economic hub for the East End, the eastern, well, Gabreski, but that's a much smaller. We're going to be developing 600 acres of property at EPCAL, all sewered. 60% of the property is preserved forever. So out of the remaining 2,100 acres, 60% is preserved forever, and that's directly in the Peconic Estuary. So we as a town are doing a lot of things. The final thing that I will say before two more things I want to point out is, in the end, nitrogen is one of the big problems. The other problem that we're having is now, unfortunately, saltwater intrusion to our wells that aren't even on the coastline, because we are pumping our wells at rates that aren't really sustainable. What are we doing with that? You all know what we're doing with it. We're putting our nitrogen on our ground, our fertilizing our lawns, and we're dumping water on top of it so we can really force it down into the drinking water. So if you want to do something, listen, I put a very low nitrogen fertilizer. I do, in the fall, in the spring, put it on to make the grass look green for a little bit of time. I don't think that's a bad thing to fertilize once a year. Don't fertilize your lawn. Have your neighbor stop fertilizing your lawn. And you know what? Brown's the new green. So if you can keep it an even shade of brown, and everybody had an even shade of brown, the aquifer would be in better shape, the water districts would be in better shape, we'd all be in better shape. The final thing that we're doing is applying to the state of New York for a grant to start sewering homes south of Peconic Bay Boulevard. We don't need to plan for this. We know what needs to be done. And so we applied to the state, and we're hopeful to get a grant that we can start what we'll call a very preliminary map and plan to start sewering the beachfront communities one at a time down Peconic Bay Boulevard. We don't need a plan. We know what has to be done. We got to stop putting the crap into a hole. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Sean. The sound of one hand clapping. Next, I'd like to pass the microphone to Supervisor Anna Thron-Holtz from the town of Southampton to talk about some of Southampton's initiatives.
Thank you, Fred, and good morning, everyone. I'm glad to see everyone here. And I just want to put a little bit of historic perspective on this. And 5 years ago, when I was first seated as supervisor, almost 6 years ago, we just started talking about what were these tides that were coming in. And they were coming in with larger frequency, different colors, choking off more of the bays. And there was this sort of surface knowledge that that was out there and that it was becoming more and more of a problem, to where we are now, where we, first of all, are sitting here with a much greater body of knowledge than we had then. You've heard every level of government over the last couple of years, from the governor to this county executive to all of us on the local level on down, organizations like PEP, et cetera, making this their priority, dealing with what is causing the degradation of our waterways, what are causing these choking tides, et cetera, et cetera. I often say that on Long Island, the economy is our environment and the environment is our economy, and they are just entirely intertwined. And so if you're planning for a robust economy and a sustainable economy, you also have to plan for robust and sustainable environmental mitigation and protection measures. So I think there's recognition on all levels of government that this is a crisis. It's a crisis that goes beyond single townships, it goes beyond single levels of government. It requires regional plans and approaches, and it requires then a very careful look amongst all of the layers of government. Bob, I think, talked earlier about the idea that dollars are being spent, need to be spent, but we are very guarded then on the government level, making sure that we spend those dollars as well as we can. And we don't always have such great history of doing that. And I find myself, and I think all of my colleagues here do too, we want to spring into action. We want to put mitigation efforts in place. We want to make sure that we're part of, no pun intended, but stemming these tides. But we're also having to be very mindful of taxpayer dollars and how we best put those to use, and make sure that we put them to use in a way that is most cost effective and with the best long-term outcomes in place. And that's not an easy lift to do. But again, it speaks to that we need to work together and have a very clear map then, both of what it's going to require to stem this tide and mitigate this nitrogen loading and all the bad effects of that, and how everyone has a very important role to play in that, and where we avoid overlap, we avoid waste, we avoid having to learn lessons along the way, try to use as much of what we know as lessons learned, et cetera, et cetera. So in the town of Southampton, we started then, and Glennis Berry is here, and she has been a great partner in the town, and we set out then to first and foremost try to map what exactly it looked like in the town of Southampton. What were the water bodies that were being affected? What was the source of the pollutants? How were they getting there? And what was in place or not to deal with that? Fred asked the question earlier, how many homes are we talking about? We know that in Suffolk County, we're talking over 360,000 homes, single and separate, that are maintained, if you will, by cesspools and septic systems on an individual basis. So sewers on the East End are few and far between, and the build out, single and separate build out, is dramatic. The next county over has about 85,000. I'm not talking Nassau County, but second to us in build out in this form has about 85,000 single and separate homes serviced then by single and separate septic and cesspool systems. So we have a dramatic reality here where we don't have sewers to deal with our type of build out. So what we set out to do then was to look at our water bodies, look at the source of contaminant, and look at what was or wasn't in place and what we then believe would be the best action plan based on all of these different realities. The data we now know, which we didn't know so much all these years ago, but we now know that 70 to 80% of the nitrogen loading does come from these single and separate cesspools. It's antiquated technology. It doesn't treat any of the pathogens or nitrogen on site. They just go into our groundwaters, and then that travels into our surface and bay water. So we set about doing this plan. We have a great GIS department, and Glennis was instrumental in working with that. And at the same time, as you know, the county set about really bringing forward and updating their plan, comprehensive water plan. We, at the same time, worked with our Sustainable Southampton advisory group, which is a great group of volunteers, and Reisman is here today, and she's been a great leader in that. And they were tasked with developing what we then know as the Sustainable Southampton 400 Plus plan. It's our 375th birthday this year, and we're looking then into our 400th years and beyond. And I would recommend that you all look at that if you haven't. It's a really well done plan. It's very user friendly, and it makes a number of recommendations on how we deal both on an individual but on a municipal level with these different issues, including looking at fertilizer and pesticide reduction programs. We are also, as part of our last budget, we partnered with SOMAS at City Stony Brook and Southampton on creating a nitrogen footprint plan. So, you know, we used to talk about your carbon footprint and everyone being able to kind of figure out what's your carbon footprint based on what kind of car you drive, et cetera, et cetera. This is a nitrogen footprint plan. So any individual who wants to go on our website once it's completed can do that and figure out just how much nitrogen might they be contributing to our environment based on your day-to-day. How many people live in your home, what kind of products do you use, how much water do you go through, how you might change some of your habits as a result of that. Understanding that education is a huge part of this. We also have the trustees in the town of Southampton that are very front and center on this. And we work with them on our pump out boat program, and we've escalated that dramatically. We have many more pump out boats than we used to have. And they travel our waterways. Anyone can take advantage of their services to get their boats pumped out and to try to stem what has been always the habit where people would, you know, take their boats a little further out, just discharge their wastewater tanks and go on their merry way. So that was a big push of ours, and we managed to get quite a bit of grant funding for that. The CPF plan was mentioned. In the town of Southampton, we've now preserved just under 4,000 acres over the last several years. It's a very robust plan. We're glad everyone who went through the headaches and the blacks and blues in getting it done did so, because as has been mentioned, that's a very important part of this. So in the last couple of years, we've focused a lot of that preservation on wetlands and bayfront properties and waterfront properties, et cetera, and where we've tried then to use that for mitigation purposes. And again, working with the trustees and some of the private organizations in eelgrass and shellfish hatchery restoration as well. So replanting eelgrass beds, reintroducing shellfish, knowing that has a very important flushing effect. We put in place a septic upgrade program, a rebate program similar to the one that many of you are familiar with, which had to do with the oil tank replacement. This would encourage upgrade to septic systems where homeowners know that their system is failing. And I'll give a word of caution on that, because as much as we're glad to spend some money on that, one of the big concerns we have is that the technology that will actually get us to where we need to be in terms of meeting standards and starting to actually reverse what we're seeing happen, not just not just do a little better, but start to reverse what we're seeing, simply isn't there yet. There is nascent technology, there is some good technology out there, but we do know that the standard isn't quite there, and it isn't there in an affordable way. There isn't a system that you can call up your septic guy and say, hey, come replace my old cesspool system and put this great new system in that will actually treat some of the nitrogen and pathogen loading and will begin to reverse the loading into our waterways, and I can afford it. That just doesn't exist today. There's stuff out there, but it doesn't exist today. And so,
Could you wrap up?
and so part of that was we initiated then, and Fred mentioned that, the New York State Clean Water Center, which is about to open its door probably in the next month. It's part of the New York State budget now, and in partnership with a philanthropy, a private philanthropy, and where we will be creating an incubator and research development center to begin to really address the affordability and the creation of these types of systems that will hopefully then be part of the real affordable and doable solutions. And
Thank you.
I love this subject.
John Cronin, Shelter Island, you want to?
John Cronin, I'm the town engineer for Town of Shelter Island. I guess one of the things that really struck me this morning when I got here was Bob DeLuca's comments on those 7 milestones out of Harvard, because very much that's the way I see the problem on Shelter Island. And probably one of the best points that I can make, just anecdotally, I'm not sure how many people in this room remember Southwest Sewer District. Can you put your hands up if you remember it? Okay, so there's a few people, but it's probably a pretty small group. I was the director of maintenance engineering for Southwest Sewer District in the 1970s, and I was a relatively young engineer at the time. And my awareness and my position at that point was that as a licensed professional engineer, the public must realize what an engineer can do for you to make your life better. And that was a pretty narrow and uninformed view. And Bob DeLuca's 7 priorities out of Harvard today was something that I just began learning in the mid-70s when I was an engineer for Suffolk County in Southwest Sewer District. And so I would submit that those points that he made today are probably the most important things you could take away from this presentation. But in terms of what we're doing on Shelter Island, and I'd like to point out that dawning awareness point that he made as the starting milestone. In my opinion, that starting milestone in Suffolk County actually began with Southwest Sewer District. So we're talking almost 40 years ago. And as we sit in this room today in 2015, that many years later, for a good number of people, we're probably still in that dawning awareness phase. And I think specifically on Shelter Island, that's the phase that I think we're at. There's only one person who really can advance some of the knowledge about septic system issues on the island. That's me as the town engineer. We have a very proactive town board and a very active town supervisor who clearly want to make this a priority. But this is a question of learning about what the problem is and what options are available. The first point that I would make in connection with the question that was raised about the cost of addressing this problem. On Shelter Island, I conducted a study about 2 years ago where we looked, with the help of a summer intern, which by the way was funded by Bob DeLuca's organization. That summer engineering intern and I began to take a very quick look initially at what we knew about septic systems on Shelter Island. And we discovered that there's probably about 50% of the systems on the island that we know nothing about. We don't know physically where they're located. We don't know how they're built. We know they exist because obviously people's plumbing is draining into them. But how they are operating, where they're located, even their ages is unknown. So one of the very first things we tried to start doing on Shelter Island was to begin a program to physically map on GIS the location of as many septic systems as we could find The thinking being that if we can identify ones that are really in dangerous areas, close to the coast, close to inland freshwater bodies, perhaps with very little clearance to the aquifer, we can then get a better understanding of what systems are really the ones at risk. But after looking at that, we began to realize that if we're going to address some of those systems, we're probably talking about spending $30 to $50 million to work on those kinds of systems. So from there, we kind of thought to ourselves, and again going through those milestones that Bob earlier mentioned, what kind of nitrogen reduction strategy can we begin with on the island if we're going to try to implement something? And so making the public aware of the fact that we were trying to map systems, making the public aware of the fact that we're starting to pay attention to it, and we were trying to do this in a fairly narrow window of time, meaning maybe a year to 18 months. That was really our preliminary step. That's how we began trying to dawn some awareness on our citizens. And one of the things that we tried to emphasize was that the saltwater aquifer on Shelter Island, which would be regarded by many people as something that is under their own property for their own use. We tried to get people thinking that that saltwater aquifer is actually part of the public town infrastructure. So drawing water from it, discharging your wastewater into it, is not something that just happens right on your building lot. It happens in a way that affects everybody on the island. So one of the very earliest things I think we were able to accomplish was to get the public thinking that that aquifer is really part of town infrastructure. It's no different than the roads you drive on, than the building department building you go into, the police station that you go into. It's part of town infrastructure. It affects everybody. So that strategy was very doable. We got a lot of people beginning to be aware that that's the way they need to perceive the aquifer. And so they started asking questions about their septic systems, about the quality of well water. All of these things began moving us in the direction of trying to implement some kind of longer range program. What's the biggest challenge for Shelter Island right now? That was one of the second points that we were asked to address. I'd say we're still in the stage right now of dawning awareness, trying to set some priorities, but we're definitely moving in a manner that is achieving those points. Probably the biggest challenge that we have is how do we address this in a practical way? In Shelter Island, the town engineer's position is about a 0.25 full-time equivalent. It's about a quarter-time job. Most things on Shelter Island that are done that are really priorities are accomplished by town committees that are staffed by volunteers. And in many instances, those volunteers, as well-meaning as they are not particularly well qualified. So that's probably one of the biggest challenges that we have. What are the essential elements for nitrogen reduction on Shelter Island? I would say the biggest one is definitely septic systems, and probably septic systems that are located either close to freshwater bodies. We have a lot of kettle hole ponds on Shelter Island. Fresh Pond, which is the largest one and among one of the largest kettle hole ponds in New York State. Definitely some issues with water quality in there that likely relate to 22 or 23 surrounding homes around that pond and problems with septic systems there. Same is true in the coastal areas where we have septic systems that are probably very close to the interface between land and Peconic Estuary waters. So addressing septic systems is probably the #1 issue, but the #2 issue clearly is also controlling runoff. Again, the MS4 program, the Stormwater Runoff Program, is largely operated by a volunteer committee. There is some oversight that comes from the town attorney and myself, but it's a very slow process in moving people towards an awareness of how to better control runoff. So all of those represent really significant issues for the town. And obviously one of the issues that begins to surface is how will we pay for these upgrades? How will we pay for these changes? There have been a number of ideas that I have personally advanced as suggestions. Some of them involve rebates, some of them involve tax abatement. But one of the points that I often make, and I've made several presentations on Shelter Island about these problems, one of the problems that points that I often make is that the median value of a home on Shelter Island is about $700,000. Obviously, we have homes that are lower than that, and we have many homes that are considerably more than that. And even if an upgraded septic system is a $25,000 or $30,000 investment, given the demographics on the island, given the price of real estate, buying homes that are multi-million-dollar homes, committing tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars to the renovations of those homes, the cost of an effective septic system really is a very small component in the value of a home that's close to $1 million. So one of the issues we have to tackle is how can we fund septic systems in some cases where obviously the homeowner is well positioned to pay for them, but in other cases some of those homeowners who have homes that are worth a considerable amount of money are actually looking at something that is their sole financial asset, and they may not be well positioned to handle the upgrade costs for septic systems. So we have tried to look at programs that might develop grants and might make funding a more practical issue for some of the older citizens on the island. We've also engaged in a program to try and upgrade the septic system that is in the town youth center, which also functions as the American Legion Center. We've been successful in getting a grant from the county to upgrade that system.
John, you can wrap up.
So I think we have kind of a unique problem on the island, and like all the other towns, we certainly have money limitations and staffing limitations. But I would encourage everyone here today to keep those milestones in mind that Bob mentioned and really see where you are on that scale of things, because that pretty much identifies how quickly you can move. Thank you.
And last but not least, the town of South Holden, Michael Collins.
Yes, thank you for having me. I'm standing in for our supervisor, Scott Russell, who couldn't make it today. Unfortunately, he had a board meeting to attend. Excuse me. I'll try and keep this brief. I would say that the two main problems that we face right now with regards to controlling nitrogen are, one is properly defining the problem. What we have to recognize is that the original standards that were set by the health department, both for density of zoning, density of development, and for the types of systems that were installed, were solely designed to protect drinking water. And what we understand is that drinking water standards for human health consumption are about 20 times higher than what they believe is the level of nitrogen in water where you start to see ecological effects. Thank you. And so really what we don't have right now is a set of tools to address that problem. We know a lot of information about how much nitrogen septic systems put into the ground. It's a lot. We know a lot about how much the current systems reduce that nitrogen. It's very, very little. And so to date, really our only tool has been the preservation fund. And in South Hold, we focused on that. We're preserving about 13 to 14 acres with our CPF fund. That's both in taking agricultural development rights and also preserving for open space. And that doesn't even take into account the open space that comes from clustering new subdivisions. But what we understand now is that that's not enough. Now the county is putting together a pilot program to test new technologies in the area, but really the question is, where do we best put those and how many are required? And I don't think that that question's been properly answered yet. What we really don't know is what's going on in the shallow interface between our bays and our embayments and our groundwater, which basically means that what your septic system is putting into the ground, if you live close to the water, it's really not going to make it into the aquifer. It's most likely going to head straight towards the nearest body of water at a varying rate depending on the soils. And so that's really the first thing we need to answer is how much nitrogen is there truly going into our bays. If you look at some of the surface water quality data that the county's put together, you'll find that in the eastern portions of South Hold, and I'm sure this is true for other towns, you can actually see surface water nitrogen levels dropping over the last 10 years. But does that mean that we've still reached a level at which the ecological health of the bays is maximized? And I don't think we know that yet. The second question is defining the solution. And to that end, I think that the most important thing is that we come up with a framework for how these types of upgrades are going to look, so that we don't have either the county setting the standard for the entire East End, nor do we have each individual municipality coming up with its own set of goals and objectives. We probably achieve a lot more by maintaining more local control of the implementation of the solution. To that end, for those of you who don't know, the East End municipalities have put together a intermunicipal group called the Peconic Estuary Protection Committee. I chair that committee, and one of our main goals for the next year is to create that type of framework, to figure out how many systems we have, where they're located, which ones have the most impact, and then use new science that will be developed to figure out if we have to reduce nitrogen by X amount, where are our limited funds best spent? And I think that's really the question we have to answer. It's not how much do we have to spend, but exactly where is it best spent? Because I think we can all agree there's probably not going to be enough to retrofit 100% of the systems in Suffolk County. So we have to get the most out of what dollars we do have available. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. Okay, we have tons of questions. Not enough time to address them all, but I'm going to try to get through a few of them until Kevin gives me the cut sign. So let me ask this question first. Do you find a difference in attitudes towards nitrogen-based issues between year-round residents and summer weekend residents? If so, might you help, let's see here, basically how would you get more summer residents more interested? That's certainly something that I think applies across the board. I know in my district, when you get east of the Shinnecock Canal, 60% of all the homes are second homes. So maybe someone from Southampton or East Hampton, anybody want to take a crack at that?
I don't see a remarkable difference, to tell you the truth, between those two demographics. I mean, I think people that live in the community year-round take advantage of the harbors and bays. You know, commercial fishermen, the people who recreationally use our water bodies care a great deal about water quality. And I think as far as second homes are concerned, I think the same thing is true. And here's how it kind of lays out in East Hampton. You know, George Capon is surrounded by some of the largest and wealthiest people in the world, okay? And they've had, you know, toxic algae blooms there. They're very concerned about this. They put up over $300,000 to hire Dr. Goldberg to do an analysis to see what exactly the kind of solutions are that would be most effective. You know, at the same time, I have issues in water bodies like Tremo Harbor and Acabonic, where, you know, local baymen make a living and local people, you know, have their boats and use it to clam and fish and recreate. So to me, it's not an issue.
I would say the same thing. I would also say that, you know, second homeowners are more likely to come here and see this as their place for recreation, for R&R, and where they want to make sure that the quality of life that they are here for and pay high taxes for and big homes and everything that Larry talked about. And they want to know that they can go out boating and swimming and canoeing and all of that, and that all of that is protected for them. So I would say they have a very high awareness and concern for that. They go to a lot of our events and money-raising opportunities to support some of our organizations. And then I think that they perhaps don't quite see too how we have the day-to-day challenges as we're balancing budgets and things of that sort, and making sure that the people who exist in a slightly different socioeconomic reality need to be able to afford to live here too. So I think it's a balancing act, but I think that they have an important role to play in helping us with that.
Supervisor Walter?
So what I want to say is that there's such a dichotomy here between the South Fork and the North Fork. The reality is when you're buying a house in Wading River or you're buying a house in anywhere in Riverhead and you're spending $300,000-$400,000 on your house, whether it's your second home or your first home, the chances of them, myself included, having another $10,000, $25,000 to put in a septic system that removes nitrogen, slim to none, slim to none. And that's, you look at that just with our CPF. We collect very little in CPF. We've preserved a couple thousand acres, but we've oversubscribed it. So there is just, I mean, the divide here is just amazing between what I'm going to call Riverhead, and I don't even think it's the same in Southold, but Riverhead East. And so since the Peconic Estuary starts in this town, somewhere in this mix, some of that CPF money from the South Fork really has to make its way up here, because otherwise, I don't know where the money comes from for all these folks buying $300,000 homes.
Which leads perfectly into the next question, which is no one town can solve the problems in the estuary, but a lack of commitment by one or more towns can cripple solutions. What is the level of coordinated commitment? The analogy, actually it was a Tony Bullock analogy that I always use, and that is, if you imagine being in a bathtub and you had 5 siblings in the bathtub, what one sibling does in the bathtub affects everybody in the bathtub. And I think this is that same question. And so it really gets to, Sean Walters said that even if the issues might be slightly different or the level of CPF money might not be the same as it is in East Hampton or Southampton, we all share the estuary, and what is that perceived level of coordinated commitment? Anybody?
You know, I want to just say, you know, I spoke to Scott Russell and he laughed about it at the last East End Supervisors Association, and gee, I'm going to get lambasted now. But, you know, governments need to start consolidating, and Southold broke off from Riverhead. Riverhead broke off from Southold years ago, 227 years ago. You know, maybe it's time to start saying, forget all these there's no difference at the Laurel line. There's really not a lot of difference between Southold and Riverhead. We need to start thinking about combining our governments. And I, for one, would be a proponent of merging Southold and Riverhead again as one town. And that would solve your North Fork problem.
Anybody else have a question?
Just say this. I mean, look, there may be different, we share a common problem. From my view, the public overwhelmingly understands the issue of water quality and the desire to protect water quality. I know in East Hampton, and I think it's probably true throughout the East End. There may be different funding sources, there may be different solutions, whether it's in Riverhead or in East Hampton, but I think we just need to come together on what those solutions are. We need to be adaptable and take into consideration the different demographics and economics, but we need certainly an East End solution, and some of those solutions might be different in each town, and let's get at it.
One point that I would make regarding that is that I think the Office of Wastewater Management, as part of Suffolk County Department of Health Services, could actually take a leadership role here, I think, by moving away from very prescriptive standards, which are currently in place regarding septic systems, and going to a performance-based standard. And in consideration of what Michael said, I think if you had some centralized guidance about various standards that you could use that said we need to try to reduce nitrogen levels to a particular practical point, and then the means by which that is achieved is done on a kind of a case-by-case basis, I think you'd have an overall strategy at that point that's laid out. Right now, we don't have that kind of strategy in place out here, which basically makes it look as though we have 5 separate local efforts going on. But I think a performance-based standard that might consider the practicality of reaching a particular level of nitrogen compound discharge would help enormously.
Okay, I'm going to do one last question. And this is kind of a broad question, but I think it's a good one to finish up on, and that is, what does our estuary look like in 10 to 20 years if this plan is successful, and what happens if it's not successful?
Great.
It's called passing.
Well, I think personally that we've seen a lot of improvement in the last 25 years. I think that while there's still a lot of challenges, I've seen a lot of encouraging signs in the bays. We've seen improvements in some of our shellfishing areas in the east with regard to bacterial levels. I personally have observed a lot more bunker, some of which unfortunately swam up the river and died. But they're larger and greater numbers of fish than I've ever seen before. I think if we implement this, maybe we could possibly bring the bays back to what they used to be and just continue along the path that we're already on.
Well, I think the fact that we are all sitting here, as you just said, Michael, and how far we've come in just the last few years from just starting to talk about this to talking about needing regional solutions, needing plans, needing mapping, needing all levels of government to participate in this. And I just want to say, I think part of that, as you just said, is the idea of setting standards here and kind of imposing that. And I think there's a bit of a chicken and egg issue there, and that's around setting standards, but knowing that they're achievable too. And making sure that we have then put our efforts around researching, developing the technology that we need to get to those standards. We've shied away from that a little bit in the town of Southampton because I worry about that we set standards, we set sustainability goals without being sure that we can actually get there. And that's the last thing I think we want is for the public to then 5 or 10 years from now say, oh, you failed. And so I think that the way we need to look at this is the way we looked at it when we were creating the Clean Water Center was, if you recall, very different subject, but the Manhattan Project, where government recognized that there was a crisis, there was an absolute technological need and race. It's related to nuclear energy. We're talking about something very different here now. But within 2 years, because all the resources were marshaled to solve that problem, government did solve that problem. That's many years ago. But again, looking at that type of effort where all resources are marshaled, recognizing what a crisis we have here, and then being able to find those solutions and putting mitigation efforts in place in due course. Hopefully in 10 years from now, we'll look back and say, just like we did with Community Preservation Fund, the Pine Barrens Act, et cetera, good for us. We actually did something.
I'll just briefly put it in economic terms. I think if we fail to maintain water quality and solve some of the problems that we have, that in 10 or 20 years, I know the economy in our town looks much different, and it's not a pretty picture. Because we rely on, quality of life in our community. It's the driver of, and it's the economic engine. It's the reason why people want to be in our community and invest in our community. And on the pro side, if we come together as a county and as municipalities and as a community, and we fix some of these problems, and we improve our water quality, then our economy is going to continue to thrive.
Ditto.
Very good.
Okay. First of all, I want to thank all of the members of the panel for their contribution today and the questions from the audience. There's one question here that wanted to know whether or not Larry Cantwell was a Muslim, but I decided not to ask that question today. We learn from the mistakes of others. And hopefully with regard to the estuary, we also learn from the mistakes of others where water quality has declined and those areas of the country have suffered both economically and environmentally. It's imperative that we act on a regional basis. I think that's one of the best parts of the estuary program is it provides the mechanism for a regional plan, for regional action, for all of the towns, and we didn't have any villages here on the panel today, but the villages are an equally important part of this planning process and this action process, and we need to act together. I think the best question in here was that no one town can do this alone, and in fact, if all of the towns don't work together, it can't succeed. And hopefully we are reigniting that process by which the 5 East End towns and the villages within the towns work together to come up with a plan that where we can stand 20 years from now or 10 years from now and say water quality got better because we did the things that are going to be helped that we're going to identify here today and with the things that happened after this meeting today. So thank you for your participation, and thank you to all the 5 towns for all the work that you're doing and for coming together today. Thank you.